Workistic, your work wellness resource on the go. A Thoughts to Inspire interview. At the Work Wellness Institute, the future of work starts with well-being. Dive into our Workplace Wellness Work Bites for summaries of our carefully curated trending webinars, published workplace research findings, and informative interviews with key industry subject matter experts. Learn and stay informed about work wellness anywhere, anytime with Workistic, your work wellness resource on the go. Welcome to our Thoughts to Inspire series, bringing together subject matter experts from across sectors to present evidence-informed, thought-provoking ideas and approaches. These interviews invite conversation and bring attention to the most pivotal and timely workplace wellness topics.
Just picking up on something that you just talked about, you mentioned Adam Smith, the hero of yours. And what I noticed in a lot of your teaching and a lot of your writing is that you draw on historical perspectives to talk about leadership. And one of the aspects I really liked about your course, when I sat down and you mentioned this, I always thought that there was I'll call it almost a dirty side to leadership, which is like, how do you actually become a leader? And you talk a little bit about, from a historical perspective and historical text and writing, about, I think your term is, how do you get people to put the crown on your head? How do you get people to perceive you as a leader? I would love if you could talk about that a little bit, because we may have people listening to this podcast who are kind of in that position. Like, how do I become a leader in my organization or my space? So maybe just talk a little bit about that for us. That would be good.
Sure. So a metaphor, as you noted, that I use in my class is the idea of the crown of leadership. And what is often the case, and I'll say this is especially true, and I'll typify here a bit with often the young men who come into my classes, particularly college students, is they think that what it means to be a leader is to kind of engage in this dramatic display that impresses everyone. They think that they can stroll into the room and simply kind of put the crown of leadership on their head and be admired by all. But of course, if you act in that way, and I think you gave the example earlier of being in group work. We've all had the example in group work where we engage with a new group of people and you have one person in the group who simply starts meting out orders. And our reaction to that person is typically a negative one. And we essentially kind of respond, well, who do you think you are, right? Well, who that person thinks he or she is the person wearing the crown. And the lesson, of course, is that when it comes to leadership and authority, certainly in kind of free democratic countries, those are things you have to earn. People put the crown on you. You can't simply put it on your own head. And when you do, you're presumptuous, you're silly, and people don't take the kind of authority you're trying to exercise seriously. People have to look to you for leadership. Why would they look to you for leadership? By virtue of the work that you've done, the accomplishments you've brought together, the way you treat people, right? How have you created that trust, that sense of loyalty, that belief, that faith, all of those qualities that are consistent with someone looking to you for leadership? Because when people begin looking to you for leadership, what they're doing is they're trying to put that crown on your head, right? We don't anoint ourselves as leaders. We can try to do that. It rarely tends to work. But to the degree that we can conduct ourselves in a way that see people put the crown on our heads, it allows us to kind of exercise a legitimate type of leadership. Most people, when they try to put the crown on their own heads, what they're trying to exercise is an illegitimate type of leadership. But that is an opportunity that we get from others. They put the crown on us, and we can't force them to do that in our favor.
One of the things we often see is leadership development and leadership training, and people take a leadership course and they're going to think that somebody's going to put that crown on their head. And what we really see is that leadership training is often very sporadic, and every 6 months you take a course, or if you're very fortunate, you have a mentor that talks to you about it. Maybe you could talk about the leadership development, and does that really work, do you think, from your perspective, or is there something more tangible in how you train to become a leader?
Well, earlier I kind of gave this metaphor of thinking of leadership as being engaged as both the potter and the clay, right? that you are kind of shaping yourself with an aim toward maximizing your capacity for leadership. And as I also said, that tends to be a lifelong process, right? With any kind of habit we attempt to cultivate, right? If you want to, write poetry really well, or learn how to play the saxophone, or paint a picture, with time you're going to get better in the process. And leadership, I think, is no different. And so when it comes to, I think, leadership development, the way not to look at it is something I'm just going to do and then forget about, right? If I want to learn how to play the saxophone, I can't just go to the lesson, learn from the teacher, and then never pick up the saxophone at home. I have to take those lessons, bring them home, and be constantly engaged in them. And I think that's really essentially what we're talking about when it comes to leadership. It's a way of life. So leadership development can be very powerful to the degree that you integrate those lessons into your life. And I would say not just in the office, but in the way that you engage people generally. The more you're doing that, you're getting that practice consistent with being a better leader. You're doing, kind of consistent with the analogy, the work of rehearsal at home on the saxophone that allows you to be better when you go back to the teacher. If you view leadership development as simply a one-off or something you do on the side that isn't integrated into your work, it won't be successful. And unfortunately, that's often what happens to be the case. And it is the responsibility of someone teaching leadership to help people understand how do they knit these lessons into their lives. But if you do that, you're changing yourself, and you're creating the habits consistent with exercising strong, successful leadership. And unless that commitment is a way of life, you ultimately aren't going to be able to kind of raise yourself to that level of leadership ability and aptitude and excellence that we all have an individual capacity for.
One of the things I've noticed about this organization in particular is we have a very diverse workforce. We quite enjoy talking, about all the different languages and perspectives that we bring to the table here when we're having a discussion. And from my own learning perspective, it makes my decisions better, right? When you can listen to people around the table that have different views and different perspectives. And so for my own leadership development, even taking on this role, it's really helped. From your perspective, what element does diversity, inclusion, and equity have with respect to leadership beyond what I have just sort of talked about?
So I would say it's both a blessing and a challenge, and the two go together. So it's a challenge in the respect that so much of leadership is understanding how to work with people, right? And the more people are like you, or the more they share the same sets of beliefs, experiences, the same kind of aptitude, well, the easier it is ultimately to engage and manage them. You don't have to, frankly, work very hard to understand them because, frankly, they're a lot like you. The more complicated and complex the groups of people we bring together are, the more the challenges on the leader to allocate time, care, and attention to understand other people, right? Because you can't take as many things for granted. In the same way that if you're, say, at home and you're with family members, you all know each other so well, you probably do share a lot of the same beliefs. There's a lot that you can take for granted in your interaction. When you're dealing with people who come from really diverse backgrounds, belief systems different from yours, experiences that are different from yours, as a leader, you have to work harder. You have to kind of stretch that capacity for empathy to get to know them. But that challenge to me becomes a blessing in two respects. One, it's the world we live in, right? Our world is increasingly complex, pluralistic, diverse. I think that's great. That's exciting. That's a wonderful challenge, but it remains a challenge. But I think on the other hand, it points to exactly what you described. And this is the second part of the blessing. It actually forces you to become a better, more agile leader, right? The leadership challenge isn't really that considerable when you're dealing with everyone who thinks the same way you think. But when you're dealing with kind of more complicated groups of people, it challenges you to be a better leader. And what you can ultimately get from people, the wider variety of experience, plays out in an ability to kind of execute projects, engage in tasks, connect with a much broader group of people than you can otherwise connect with if you have a largely homogenous group. So if you think back to, say, the class that we were part of, I think in your class we had something on the order of about 87 students from maybe 34 different countries, if I remember my numbers correctly.
That's impressive.
for me, that's a challenge because you all come into the classroom, you're from all over the world. Not you necessarily, but so many of the students are jet lagged, right? Because they've come from the other side of the earth. Most of them, English is not their first language, it may be their third or fourth language. And they're excited, and there's that sense of vulnerability there because they don't know what to expect. And for me as a leader, it's a great opportunity to find a way to bring all these people together, to create the relationships you were describing a little bit earlier, and to bring the very best out of them. It might be easier if everyone looked like me, thought like me, had the same background I did, but as a leader in a classroom, it wouldn't be nearly as much fun, and the kind of experience you can ultimately hope to pull out of it wouldn't be nearly as compelling as what I have each and every summer. So it's certainly a challenge, and it forces me to listen, to care, to be concerned, and to allocate time to do that. But when it works, when in a classroom you put together a great class as a team leader, you lead a great team in an office environment, you create a dynamic office, you get so much more out of that experience. It's so much richer, more potent and powerful in what you're able to do as a team than if you just had a homogenous group of people. So for me, the challenge is one that is worth taking on and plays out in wonderful ways.
When we were finished with your class, I think, I mentioned that we would go out after class. We sit around the table, or even at
the Daedalus group,
the
right?
Daedalus Society is what we actually call it. Yes, we had a Facebook page and everything at the time. What was really interesting about that group is we would be sitting around the table later at night, and we'd be discussing the lessons of your class, which I think, from a professor's perspective, I would love to hear that in the classes I teach. But what was really interesting is that the languages that were spoken around the table, the languages start off in English and it would go to French, and then there'd be German, and there'd be, and that was the discussion around the table. But it was also the cultural perspective on the lessons that were from your class. And I thought that was, from my experience, there was an awful lot of learning that took place there. And I think part of the reason why the group from your class has stuck together, and there was a bit of reunion last summer, is because those kind of learning experience that you facilitate really is what you end up doing. So I certainly appreciate that. But you mentioned, you talked about the times in which we live. We've just come through the COVID pandemic. And, in this organization, we were asked a lot. The phone was ringing off the hook at this sort of the start of the pandemic, and what do we do about COVID? Are we 2 feet apart? Are we 2 meters apart? Are we 10? Do we wear masks? Don't we wear masks? And how do we put that into a workplace? But one of the problems that they always come up with, or one of the questions, is that now my staff are all working from home. How do I lead in an E environment, if that's what you want to call it, or how is it now when most people have moved to a hybrid model? How do you lead a hybrid environment when you don't have that opportunity for those close social connections? When that person, you see them every day and you can say, how's the dog doing today? Is there some secret sauce that we can implement around hybrid workplaces that you're aware of?
Well, I give 2 answers. I think one, you were part of, I think, the second to the last class I had at Harvard before COVID hit. And so I had been teaching at that point in time for 15 years at Harvard. And now suddenly I was in a position where I was going to have to lead a virtual class. And as everyone who's in that situation, trying to think through, there are all these challenges that I've not thought through before. There's a totally new way of doing kind of business broadly construed. And how do I tackle those challenges? The first thing I would say is that I think, especially with remote work and some of the challenges that COVID faced, it's all right to acknowledge it's difficult. In fact, I actually think as a leader that's important. One of the things that I would tell my students when we were dealing with some of these challenges is that this is difficult, and this will challenge you in certain ways, but that's okay. We have to be gentle on ourselves. We have to understand that this is a tough time, and we have to be patient with one another. And I think people appreciated that when you're in a position of leadership, offering that dispensation. It's okay. This is going to be a challenge we have to deal with. we're figuring this out in real time, be gentle with yourself, I think is important. Because also it I think creates a perspective on what's going on that allows people to know that if they can't figure things out or they can't get the computer working or they're just feeling a great deal of stress, that's okay. We need to acknowledge that and we need to find ways to work within that. The second way I would answer your question, though, is that you're absolutely right that especially in terms of leadership and teaching, not having that face-to-face time, that three-dimensional face-to-face time as opposed to two-dimensional, we lose something. But I think there are ways in which we can try to gain back at least elements of that human interaction. And I think it actually cuts to something you just pointed out with respect to my own class. So when I lead the leadership class, I tell my teaching assistants that I know we will have succeeded if at the very end of class, a third of the students are lingering to meet and speak with one another, right? Because they're beginning to do the work for us. And certainly in the way in which I design my classes, I try to prompt that. You're already given certain assignments on day one. You're going to have to start kind of organizing your time and figuring out with the team presentations, how do you kind of coordinate? And what that does is it kind of creates a momentum early on to begin interacting. And if you begin interacting, and I give you opportunities that are largely unstructured to interact, I trust you're going to create those relationships, right? And in fact, that it won't just mean that you'll have those kind of strong friendships, but it may mean that you'll head off to Daedalus and you'll have a conversation about the things that we discussed in class. I think as a leader, and sometimes it's hard to do in a professional environment, what you have to find are those opportunities for people that are unstructured to connect and interact. And it can be as simple as, hey, let's go run and get some donuts and bring it back to the office. And in that 15-minute period where we're running and getting donuts, we're probably not necessarily talking about the work at hand. We're asking one another about our families, right? What people are going through, a trip that people are planning. I think as a leader, the more that you create that unstructured time, the better off you are. And you even have to find ways to do that when we're on Zoom.
We talked a little bit about hybrid workplaces and leadership in a hybrid environment. We've approached a lot of our projects here recently around, it's not necessarily COVID, but disruptive events in the future. COVID is just one kind of isolated thing. There may be something else that comes down the road. Do you think these disruptive events are really changing the nature of leadership at all?
I mean, I think what they're forcing us all to do, and I think this is both leaders, but also the responsibility of leaders with the people they lead, is to train us for a greater degree of dexterity, right? We have to have a lot more flexibility in a world with a great deal more disruption. But we all had to show that when COVID came about. We had to figure out how can we do the work that we do, how can we lead the teams we lead when we're going to be sitting at home for the next 4, 5, 6, however many months. That took a lot of dexterity, and with that dexterity, a great deal of stress to get through moments like that. And I think that as a leader, when dealing with disruption, on the one hand, how do you train people to be agile, to be nimble, to be prepared to react to that disruption on the one hand? But on the other hand, how do you figure out ways in which to shepherd people through those highly stressful times, right? Because both of those things go together. It's not just helping people to kind of be, in a good sense, more reactive to that disruption, but also that the disruption doesn't kind of traumatize them in kind of small or in fact, meaningful ways. I think it's a challenge we're still dealing with in hindsight with respect to COVID. But I think in a world where we seem to kind of embrace disruption, I know at least certainly in the United States, we often will lionize disruption to a place like a business school. I think the more that our world seems like it's going to be choppy and turbulent, the more we have to be prepared for that kind of sailing. And as a leader, the more you have to prepare people around you for a world that will constantly be dealing them surprises. That's hard to do. But I think the more as a leader you can think that through and troubleshoot, and also sometimes just acknowledge that it's difficult, right? We don't know exactly what to do, but we're going to figure it out because we're working together and we've got a good team. And that doesn't mean we will make always the right decisions immediately, but we can trust that we'll find a way to kind of get to the end of the hallway and get out into the light again. Leaders have to do that. And I think you're right that in a time of disruption, that's even more important than it has been before.
I also think in many respects, it's changing our followers, it's changing followers in general.
Mm-hmm.
Expectations after the pandemic, we see labor market issues where, people are willing to jump to the next job, or they're not interested in working as much. Fortunately, our team here is fantastic and they're all very motivated. But I think the nature of employees, and we'll use the term followers, is changing. And I think leadership has to recognize that. How do we get leaders to understand that the nature of sort of followers in these disruptive events is changing?
I think it's a real challenge. I mean, as with any kind of experience or rather kind of habit that you've cultivated, leaders have a way of doing things. And especially if they've found success with them, they kind of don't want to change, right? Most of us are kind of stubborn in the face of our own success. And so if you've done something quite well, you really don't want to try something else you may not necessarily be as good at. But I think that need for agility among kind of team members is absolutely as essential as it is for leaders themselves. In part because if you have very agile team members, but a very stubborn leader, the job won't get done. And if you have the most agile leader, but stubborn team members, the job tends not to get done either. That agility has to work together, right? You all have to show that kind of flexibility, that adaptability that disruption ultimately demands of you. But that means kind of creating an environment where I think people become comfortable with change, where people are willing to kind of bring forward questions about new changes, make proposals, find ways of doing things differently, and offer, in the best sense, good, productive criticism. Well, this is the way we've done things for a very long period of time. Maybe we should try to find a way to do it differently, or at least think about doing things differently. That is its own kind of disruption. And the more an environment is comfortable with that, and people feel as though if they're going to offer something, they aren't being disruptive, they're trying to offer a change that will improve the way you do work. The more as a leader you create an environment like that and train the people around you to participate in it, the more you can not only kind of not just address disruption or react to disruption, but even take advantage of it.
So the premium on a psychologically safe and healthy workplace, creating that environment as a leader is ultimately important to be able to navigate those kind of disruptive events, is kind of what you're saying.
Absolutely. Disruptive events are traumatizing, right? So, what I, at the opposite extreme, when I'm teaching at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago, a lot of my students tend to embrace disruption, right? They think, oh, disruption is an unalloyed good. And I often say to them, well, let's give disruption its credit. When you are disrupting things, you're creating concerns and problems for people. You're introducing new things. You're changing the way business is done in a way that can cause people a lot of concern. In order to do that successfully, you have to meet people where they are, and you have to help them embrace that disruption. Otherwise, you're just disrupting them, right? And so the ability to create an environment that, again, I'd like to think more in terms of agility, right? If you're agile, you can react very quickly to changes and they don't overwhelm you. But as a leader, that's your responsibility, not just to kind of have that mindset yourself, but to help others not just have that mindset, but to embrace disruption, not only as a challenge, but as an opportunity, and to demonstrate the ways in which by embracing it as an opportunity, you can do things better. That's your responsibility as a leader. You can't expect the people around you to do that. But what it means is you have to kind of acknowledge when things are disruptive and the difficulties it's causing for people, and then kind of honor their experience and find ways to tap into it, to not just, again, work through that disruption, but turn it into some kind of good. That takes time, attention, care, and energy. And when you simply kind of take disruption for granted or you lionize disruption, you don't tend to do that. And that tends to lead to failings as a leader.
Yeah. In my own dissertation work, I looked at change management practices. And one of the things that always stuck out was the perception from the employer that change was always going to be positive and it was always going to be good. However, from an employee perspective, change, unless it was very much aligned with their own particular values, was always perceived as a negative. And the communication that actually needs to happen ahead of time to make that change successful, it's always underestimated at the end of the day. So when you're working and you're coaching and mentoring around leadership these days, what are you really focusing on? If Cam Stockdale is a mentee of yours, what do you do? What do you tell me is kind of the next steps? What are you focusing on?
Well, I think when I'm kind of dealing with leaders today, often you're doing a kind of very personal assessment, right? You're looking for their strengths and their weaknesses. But I think if you're speaking in kind of more general terms, what you're trying to get people to kind of grasp is exactly what you're pointing to, which is, especially if you're a younger leader and the horizon of your leadership is 25, 35 years, boy, things are going to change dramatically in that time, right? If you think back, 35 years ago, we are in the late 80s.
Great time.
A great time, a wonderful time. We both remember it well.
Yeah.
But if you think about the difference between 1988 and 2023, it's extraordinary. You couldn't even begin to account for the number of differences. And so the question becomes, what do you have to do? What kinds of sensibilities, habits, cultural tendencies do you need to cultivate? Not necessarily to be ready for specific types of changes, right? Sometimes we can play prophet and we know the way in which things will look in 35 years. But what can we do to adapt ourselves to just be ready for change, right? How do we keep ourselves open-minded? Keep ourselves open to new experiences? How do we keep kind of looking at the world around us? One of the problems of success is you become very good at something very small, and you do it over and over and over again. And what that leads to is a kind of blinders to the broader world. So how do you make sure you are allocating time in your schedule, even when you're successful, to make sure that you will have that adaptability, that agility that's going to serve you well 10 or 20 years from now, right? There are plenty of stories of leaders who are successful at this point in time and then fail a little bit later because they can't adapt and they can't change. And so especially with younger leaders, in particular those who are successful, finding ways to make sure that they continue to have that play in the joints, that they don't become too kind of self-assured and too confident in the success that they've had. It may well be the case that nothing about their professional environment will change in 35 years. I'd bet it goes the other way, and in most cases that's true. And the more that you can help leaders gain that agility, the better you are preparing them for the future, whatever the future may bring.
One of the books I really like is by Howard Gardner out of Harvard, right? The 5 Minds of the Future. I love that perspective about keeping yourself pliable, the kind of perspectives you need to have for the future as a leader. Is there a particular area of leadership that you would say to people now that you need to focus on? This is the thing. This is, besides just being adaptable and pliable.
Well, the one virtue that I always emphasize to people that I think is deeply undervalued by leaders generally, or people who think about leadership, is patience, right? And there are a few reasons for that. One, people who are drawn to leadership tend to be disproportionately type A aggressive personalities. They tend to be impatient by nature. So as a corrective to that behavior, you have to tell them to be patient. The second reason I think patience is really very, very important when it comes to leadership is insofar as leadership is a human-focused art, humans are frustrating, right? They don't do exactly what you want them to do when you want them to do it in the way that you would so choose. You have to explain things to them. You have to kind of deal with their frustrations and their concerns and their own personal aspirations. People are not computers, and you can't simply just program. Now, the flip side of that is that's why humans are interesting and joyous and wonderful and exciting. But we've all had to kind of manage different types of personalities in people, and sometimes you just want to say, oh, just do it. Just go and do it, and get back to me when it's done. But we know that one, that doesn't bring out the very best performance in people. 2, it often doesn't do the job of explaining to them what needs to be done. And 3, it just shreds the trust that you have with others. But insofar as you're also a human being, full of strengths and flaws as well too, you have to remember and commit to that patience so that you don't overstep your own bounds and make your own mistakes or let your peak show. And the more that I think you lean into that patience and you exercise that patience, it is helpful in respect to kind of anticipating and being ready for major changes. It's helpful for dealing with people who come from backgrounds you're not familiar with. You have to be patient enough to understand what their concerns are and why they kind of deserve special consideration or attention, or at least your understanding. It also is essential because there will be times when you're working late at night and you're tired and everyone else is tired, and your best behavior tends not to come out when you're tired. And so the more that you commit to patience as a practiced virtue, right, the more that you are able to kind of conserve your greatest successes and build upon your strengths, but at the same time create that sense of trust and loyalty among the people you work with, which not only helps to get the job done, but also demonstrates to them how they need to interact with one another, right? The example that I would give is that at the very end of the classes that I teach, they're long classes, as you may remember, you will have students who will come up and they'll want to ask questions. And these tend to be very large classes, so you'll have 3 or 4 or 5 people. And my teaching assistants are waiting there. It's 9:30 at night. They want to go home. And I remember once when my teaching assistant saying, "But you're always really patient and you answer all the questions that the students have. You must be tired too. Why do you do that?" And I gave 2 answers. I said, well, one, that's my job, right? That's what I'm paid to do, which is to engage these students, to answer their questions when they're put forward sincerely. But I said, secondly, when I do that for them, what do you do for our students when you're in class with them? Well, I show them the same patience too. What do you think they do for one another? Well, they show themselves the respect of asking questions and being engaged. I'm trying to give them an example by my behavior. If I've been teaching for 3 hours, sure, I want to go home and go to bed too. I'm tired. But I know that as the leader within that class, I have to give that best example. And even if my back is hurt, my lower back is hurting and I'm tired and I want to go to sleep, it's my responsibility as a teacher to do that. And I also know that by giving that example of leadership, by showing that patience, other students will do it for other students. The teaching assistants will do it for their charges. And so I'm giving an example as well too of patience that I expect that they will take on. So to me, patience is, it's an age-old virtue. It's something I always come back to. But to me, it's a virtue that pays incredible dividends. And it's one worthy of kind of thinking about and cultivating in any world, but especially a world which demands a lot of patience. And a world of change certainly does.
Yeah, we used to laugh actually that at the end of class, we'd all be discussing where are we all going. And the lineup would be 20 people deep trying to get to you. Like, well, we can't give him an invitation because he's going to be here for another hour. It's not happening. You've mentioned a couple of times today trust, and maybe trust. The topic of trust could be an entire podcast or a series of podcasts. How do you get followers? How do you get people, employees, staff to trust you? What's the I know it's a big topic, but at the end of the day, is there something that you have found that some behavior needed to demonstrate? What is it? How do you get people to trust you as a leader?
Well, I'd give 2 responses to that. I think the first is, like the very best virtues, they take time to cultivate, right? You don't trust someone overnight. It takes time and routine behavior. Trust is about being able to identify a behavior pattern and fit someone into it. This is the way, this person has acted for the last 100 days. Therefore, I expect on the 101st day, they'll act that way as well too. And insofar as they do, I trust their behavior, right? On day 1, I don't know what to trust because I don't know as much about another person. They haven't been pressure tested in my presence. So trust takes time to build. And I think that's the first thing I would say. And so as a leader, you can expect that you're going to achieve that level of trust on day 1. It's going to take a little while. The second thing I would say is that when you're thinking about trust in particular, you're thinking about consistency of behavior, right? We all have those examples in our lives where we've engaged someone who's treated us one way and then treated us a very different way, or have presented themselves in one way, and then you kind of catch sight of them in a slightly different scenario and their behavior is inconsistent with that. And when you see that inconsistency, it's very hard to trust someone, right? If someone says, I will be patient, I will be there for you, I will hear your concerns, and they're not patient, they're not there for you, and they don't hear your concerns, you can't trust ultimately their word. So that reliability in behavior that you have to sustain over a large period of time. It's one of the reasons that patience is so important. It takes a long time to build up something like trust, but if you act in an untrustworthy way, it's gone, just like that. And so when you're thinking about that kind of behavior, and again, it's hard. It's hard to be that consistent. But trust is something that is built up over time. It can be destroyed very quickly. And it's about kind of creating a routine of predictability, a kind of moral predictability that people can invest in when it comes to you. And so the more that you can kind of carve that out and be familiar and reliable in that way, and I would say at the same time, especially when you're dealing with team members, the more you can also come through on the bargain of being there for them, right? If you say as a leader, I'm going to allocate time for you, I'm going to be there for you, well, then you have to live up to those words. It's easy to say those things, and we all want to feel like that's the person that we are. We all want to feel that we're a good, trustworthy, honest person. But you have to be good and trustworthy and honest. It's not enough to simply want to feel that way or to enjoy that. You have to make the commitments to live it out. And the commitments aren't always necessarily, certainly the most glamorous or the most fun. Like you said, when I'm at student 19 of students who are 20 deep and I'm really tired, I don't necessarily want to stand there and answer this question, but I know that that's my responsibility. And that if I don't fulfill it, I am going to kind of hazard the trust that I have with students that I'm there for them, that my time is their time. It's a price that you pay, right? Trust isn't free and it shouldn't come cheap. It's not worth anything if it comes cheap. But then you have to think about the investments required over a long period of time to come through on it. Leadership, and we talked about this in our class, and you know this from your experience, any leader does, leadership is really difficult. There's a point typically when I'm leading the class, and it will in particular often be a young student, someone from college. There'll be a few college students who slip into what is otherwise a graduate school class. And they'll come up to me and they'll say, John Paul, this doesn't sound like it's a lot of fun. I thought leadership was supposed to be fun. And what they think about are the high profile elements, right? Being in the spotlight, being the person looked to, having that glow about you. And certainly those elements are flattering. But leadership properly executed is incredibly hard work. It's not fun. It's not glamorous. It's stressful, right? You have to show that patience even when people aren't around you or showing it. And I love it when students come up and finally say that, because I say, you're right, it isn't.
You got it now.
You got it. You figured it out. And you have to figure out for yourself, is this the kind of work that I want to do? Some people are much happier, sitting at the engineer's bench and working on the project at hand, right? Or coding, or doing something that isn't as people-facing. But to be engaged in leadership is to constantly be engaged with other human beings and to work to bring out the best in them. That means you can't do everything on your own time. You have to find a way to manage between the needs of your time and the needs of the time of everyone else to get the job done. That's stressful, and it's not necessarily work for everyone, but knowing that up front allows you to kind of commit to the behavior necessary to bring out the best performance in others and also in yourself. And I think, and you've had the same experience as well too, notwithstanding all those sacrifices and those challenges, when you can do that work well, it's immensely rewarding. And you create these abiding relationships that don't just bring a lot to your work, but I think bring a lot to your life as well too.
You ever measured how far you actually walk across the stage in any one class?
Well, I will let you in on one insight.
Yeah.
So as you remember, our classroom is fairly large.
Yeah.
And I would say that if I could speak to the designer of the classroom, I would tell that person that putting a podium on one far end of the stage is not the best place to put it if you're leading a classroom and you have students who are on the other side. Students in section 4, they feel like they should deserve some love as well too, but you're on the other side of the stage. And so early on in using this classroom, I developed kind of the Panther approach to teaching, which is you begin to kind of pace back and forth like you're in the cage up front.
Yeah.
And I will say that when I feel that students are beginning to fall asleep, and it's a 3-hour class at night, so around about 9:15 people do fall asleep, The panther then invades the space and leaves the cage and begins going up into the rows. Because what I have found is that if students are falling asleep and they see their professor coming at them up the row, they kind of wake back up. So I've never put on a Fitbit and figured out how much I walk, but certainly it's sometimes the most exercise I certainly get for those 3 weeks is the pacing that goes on in that classroom.
I'll tell you a little secret then. Some of the students tried to extrapolate how many steps you were actually taking. They counted sort of like over a 2-minute span the number of steps, and then tried to calculate out, well, potentially how many steps were you taking. The problem is that you start sprinting from one side to the other at times, and it threw them right off at the end of the day. So one day you're going to have to put on a Fitbit.
I like to just put on the Fitbit and make it easier. We could run it live on the screen,
yes.
And we could keep track of how far I'm going.
Oh, I've never even thought of that. Okay, well, that's something we're going to work on next time. We've talked a lot about leadership today and how to develop your leadership skills and followers. Is there anything that you think we need to cover that we haven't talked about that our listeners really should try to grasp onto?
Well, I think, and this may be a little bit redundant, but I think to me the most important takeaway that I try to communicate to students is that they shouldn't think of leadership in technical terms, but in human terms, right? This is not about mastering numbers on a spreadsheet, right? Or getting the math right if you're an accountant. This is about engaging human beings. And the most important part about engaging human beings in a world of wonderful complexity, right, is that you have to meet them where they stand. You can't take people for granted. You have to make time to understand who they are, to ask for their story, to connect with them. And that's job one. If I'm creating a team, the first thing I need to do is meet those people and begin the process of building that trust. There's no shortcut I can take. There's no algorithm I can kind of implement. It's meeting people one-on-one where they stand and creating that opportunity for connection. That's where leadership starts. It's not the whole of leadership, but if you start there, you have a kind of path toward successful leadership and the trust and loyalty and faith that comes with that. If you have much more of a technical approach, you'll stumble right out of the gates.
So this is, for those academics out there, this is a much more social sciences and humanities route than it is STEM sciences.
I mean, with all due love, affection, and respect for my colleagues who are in the STEM field, yes, I think that's true. I think, look, all we need to do is look around to see the extraordinary blessings that modern technology has brought us. But some things don't change. Some things can't be rendered into an algorithm. Some things warrant simply sitting down as we are right here, having a conversation, learning from one another, showing the mutual respect in that, listening to one another's stories. That was true hundreds of years ago, and it will be true hundreds of years hence, no matter what ChatGPT ultimately comes up with. But students who are sometimes looking for those shortcuts in a busy world, well, how can I just get to the leadership part? Well, that is the leadership part. That human connection is the essence of leadership. And there's no, shortcut you can get around that. And so that starts with that, again, that question of orientation toward others. How do you turn that energy outward to connect with people, to begin building that trust? There is no shortcut, and that's why patience is necessary. And so if you think in terms, again, of a human-focused art, which seems so different from our modern technological world, where we're finding efficiency in everything, what I would say is it's great that we're finding efficiency in all of those things so we can allocate more time to those human elements that simply aren't going to change. And I would say, blessedly so.
It's interesting how much patience plays a central role in what you're discussing. We had a Thoughts to Inspire podcast with Greg Millen, who I did a master's degree with a number of years ago. And he's been working in an area of character leadership. He's done a lot of work in that area at university. And patience is something that comes up time and time again as an important element of character in leadership. So there's these reoccurring themes and strings throughout a number of what our guests have talked about. Successful leadership, patience. It's those relationships building over time to create those environments in that culture.
for me at least, it's really, I'm heartened to hear that other people are thinking about this as well too. The way I would just put it in perspective is that it takes a lot of time and effort to build strong relationships. And we all know that those strong relationships can be hurt or deeply undermined very quickly, right? And often it comes about because we're tired or we're a little bit impatient. We say something we shouldn't have said. We treat someone in a way that they ought not to have been treated. And once you do that, it isn't as though you've kind of bankrupted the trust between two people, but you have to start building that capital again. And so the greater your store of patience, at the very least, you're not kind of creating those, those errors in your relationships, those unenforced errors that sees you kind of take down the trust, the capital that you've built up of trust. And so at the very least, in kind of keeping you moving in that positive direction, patience becomes important. But I also just think that we're in a world where people are constantly competing for our time. Those ridiculous phones we keep in our pocket are constantly competing for our time. One thing that I had a professor at Harvard many years ago say to me was that he said, "John Paul, you wouldn't have imagined how great life was to be a teacher before email." He said students would sometimes come to your office hours, and occasionally they would call, but for the most part they left you alone. But they will send you a 3 a.m. Email without any kind of hesitation whatsoever. And what he was basically saying is that we live in a world where, because of modern technology, more and more of our time is taken up, one, and two, more and more of our time is tempted to be taken away, right? When I'm on, say, Twitter and refreshing, I know that I'm wasting time and I shouldn't be, but the temptation is too strong and it's right there. And at the same time, when I open up my inbox and I see 35 new emails, and I think to myself, I just checked this inbox 35 minutes ago, how can I be getting an email a minute? That competition is there for our time in terms of people asking for it, but also the temptation for it to be taken away. And all of those things eat into our ability to kind of connect with other people. And that's why, again, that practice of patience becomes even more important, because it cuts against the kind of world that we live in and that time competition. And the more that you can think about that and cultivate that commitment, the easier it's going to be to meet those challenges, as opposed to always lapse once again into kind of checking your phone or getting lost in your email. Sometimes it's better to be lost in conversation.
Yeah.
That's why I've kind of really valued getting a chance to sit here and chat without any phones whatsoever.
Mine's on silent right now. It's interesting because we've gone to a 4-day work week here in the organization. And it's so easy for me to, look at my phone and I'm going to say accidentally, open up my email and take a look at it. I'm like, oh, if I just spend 5 minutes, answering my email on the phone, and that 5 minutes turns into half an hour. Right. So I'm living proof of what you speak. So thank you very much. I certainly appreciate your time, and I look forward to doing this again sometime.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cameron. It's been great being here.
Continue your learning and connect with us at www.workwellnessinstitute.org.